Happy early 4th of July, Highlands Presbyterian. So today we're continuing on in our series on Samson, and we're in Judges 15. And I'm just going to read a few verses out of here and sort of talk more about the big picture overview throughout the sermon. So Judges 15, starting in verse 3, "And Samson said to them, 'This time I shall be innocent in regard to the Philistines when I do them harm.' So Samson went and caught 300 foxes and took torches. And he turned them tail to tail and put a torch between each pair of tails. And when he had set fire to the torches, he let the foxes go into the standing grain of the Philistines, and set fire to the stacked grain and the standing grain, as well as the olive orchards." And then skipping ahead to verse 10, "And the men of Judah said, 'Why have you come up against us?' The Philistines said, 'We have come up to bind Samson, to do to him as he did to us.' Then 3,000 men of Judah went down to the cleft of the rock of Etam and said to Samson, 'Do you not know that the Philistines are rulers over us? What then is this that you have done to us?' And he said to them, 'As they did to me, so have I done to them.'" So the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. So in honor of July 4th, I thought we'd start with a little history lesson. So 1773, the British Parliament, so they were trying to support the East India Company, and so they passed the Tea Act, which reduced the importation duties that the company imported tea into the U.S. And this followed 1767, the passage of the Townshend Act, which had taxed various commodities, including tea. The British were trying to recoup some of the money they'd spent during the French and Indian War. And so they passed these, which were incredibly unpopular, and they ended up repealing all but one of them. And the one they left was the one on tea. And so there's this extra tax on tea, and then they reduce the duties the East India Company pays on tea, so basically sort of giving them an advantage to sell tea into the U.S. market. So late in 1773, the East India Company dispatches 7 ships to the U.S. There's Philadelphia, New York, Charleston. Those are met by protests. 2 aren't even allowed to unload anything. They return to England. 1 can unload, but there's protests there, and the tea is seized. And so there's one of the ships sinks. 3 end up in Boston, and there were these huge protests, and so they weren't permitted to unload this shipment of tea. And eventually over 100 members of the Sons of Liberty board the 3 ships, and they throw 342 chests of tea into the harbor. Right, so British Parliament is outraged. They pass the Intolerable Acts, this series of laws, and it only heightens tension between the 2 regions. And what these laws did is they unified the colonies. And so in 1774, the First Continental Congress sets up militias in each colony. They decide to end trade with Britain. And then in 1775, we have the battles of Lexington and Concord, right? And now, right, we have fireworks, we have hot dogs, right? All of, we call football soccer, right? There's all these things that have happened after that, right? So we have our independence, and so much of it was rooted in these small tax laws that the British passed trying to recoup their investment, right? Something small, and then that escalates, right? This ever-increasing series of retaliatory events, right? There's one tiny spark, right? It leads to war, right? Catching countless lives into the maelstrom, right? All of them are part of something huge, right? All of it rooted in this tax. I mean, the tax was, right, a symptom of disconnect between the 2, but it just took that spark to set off the fire. And then one side retaliates, the other side retaliates, the other side retaliates, and it just escalates. Right, and this is the story that we find ourselves reading when we read Judges 15, right? When we last left Samson, he was abandoning his new wife who had betrayed him out of this very real fear for her life and the life of her family. Well, here in chapter 15, he seems to come back to her and sort of just expects everything to be okay. But her father has given her to someone else, right? Interpreting the acts of Samson as saying he didn't want anything to do with her. And so Samson's upset. Remember, these are Philistines. So Samson's upset, and so what he does is peculiar. at best. He captures 300 foxes, ties their tails together, puts a torch in between their tails, and sends them out into the harvest. The best thing I can say, it's an odd technique. I will leave it to the military historians among us. But I don't believe this is a common battlefield tactic. But it's devastating to the Philistines, for it's right in the middle of the harvest, right? It talks about grain being stacked for harvest. And so as a result, the Philistines attack and kill Samson's wife and family, which is the very thing she was trying to avoid in the beginning. And then Samson, despite having abandoned her, he physically assaults this group of Philistines. Right? And the Israelites, they're watching this cycle of violence, and they see themselves getting caught up in it, and they're afraid for themselves, just like Samson's wife was. And so they hand Samson over to the Philistines. He allows himself to be bound by the Israelites and to be handed over. Once he's in the hands of his enemies, right, he becomes enraged. The ropes, we're told, fall off. He grabs the jawbone of a donkey and kills 1,000 Philistines, right? And it escalates, right? All out of sort of Samson's rejections, the cycles of violence grow. These are like ripples on a once still pond radiating out, right? One act of violence is answered by another, and it's this escalating series of retaliation and violence, grabbing more and more lives, devouring lives, communities as it goes, right? This is how sin works in our lives, in our hearts, in our relationships, in our communities, right? It never starts big. It starts with a small act, right? One small temptation, one small slight. And then it escalates, right? And sin grabs a little more of our heart every time. One small bite. Maybe you don't even notice it at first. Maybe you think you can control it. But it grows and it grows and it grows. Think about strained relationships you may have in your life. I bet if you go back, right, to the history of the strain, a lot of them started small, right? They started with a quarrel or something else, but it grows. And over time, it takes on a life of its own. Right? And soon the entire relationship is strained, right? Maybe even to open conflict, all because of this tiny root, right? It's like an oak tree growing out of the smallest acorn. Right? It's sin. This is what it does to us, and it works. It's been at work for thousands of years. Right? We see the story from Judges. We get lost in sort of the foxes and the jawbones, which are odd, but we see the same pattern in society today, right? Somebody gets upset over something small, right? And in today's society, right, the next thing you know, people are shooting at each other. Right? It happens every day in this country. It's because sin and the forces of evil, they know how to sow seeds effectively, and they water them, right, through the powers of resentment. Right? You let it fester for a little while, and then pretty soon you have open violence. Right? And so the good news, right, of Judges 15 is that as sin is working to escalate violence, right, God is at work here in this story. God is working through Samson, right? Now, Samson is incredibly imperfect, and we see, right, that God is at work, but there's this brokenness present in society. But the story, right, the violence is in it, right, shows the necessity of God's saving action, right? There's a battle to deliver Israelites from their captives, right? And there's a battle to deliver you from your captor, right? And it's the same battle to free God's people, right? And if God is willing to light the fields of the enemy on fire with torches held in the tails of foxes, right, then there's no limit to the creativity of God's salvation, right? God will do anything. God will try anything to save God's people from oppression and from sin, right? The Israelites are oppressed by the Philistines, a stronger force than they, and they are afraid. Right? And in this fear, they're handing over Samson, trying just to get out alive. They're binding the strong man that has come to save them. But God isn't giving up. Right? It's interesting to see, they see the cycle of violence. They want to make this offering to stop it. Right? But Samson is the one who needs to be offered. Right? Later, like we discussed later we discussed last week, in their offering of their hero, they're pointing ahead to the true offering that is to come, the true strong man, who will be held by bonds of love, not by ropes. Love holds him to the cross because he's the one who needs to be offered. To truly show hope, to show an end to the cycle, to the way that sin devours and destroys. right? God sees the way that sin is eating away at us, and God is willing to offer God's self to us because God refuses to let go. God refuses to give up. And so just a few things here before we close. And one is that it's so important for us to break the cycles, right, of sin and violence in our lives. C.S. Lewis, has this wonderful passage where he talks about hell as the extension of the life, or he talks about sort of hell as the extension of our flaws, extension of our sins, the life we live now, right? Our tempers and our minor flaws, right? They take footholds, and maybe over 20 years or 40 years, if they grow little by little, they're not a major dominating force in our lives. But if you stretch that out to eternity, if they continue to grow, in 1,000,000 years, that may be all that's left. If we let that take root and grow and grow and grow, it might be so big, there's nothing else left. And so the will of God is to free us from the powers of sin and evil. And so our job, our responsibility, right, is to see the small sins, the small actions, the small seeds that are planted that can lead to conflict and brokenness. In Matthew 5, Jesus tells us to turn the other cheek. And sometimes that's read as passivity, but I think a better way to understand it is to think of it as a change in posture. As you're not just letting things continue as they are and just standing there and continue to be engaged in the cycle of violence, but you're changing. You're offering a different perspective, a different posture. You're saying, we won't just continue to do this, but let's try something new. And maybe there is an offering where it's hard for us to give that, but it's changing the situation. It's stepping in and noting that this is only going to grow and only going to turn into this retaliatory cycle. And so change the way we are positioned. And maybe there's a better path forward. Notice the sin and the violence and the brokenness and the small ways that it takes root. And so finally, and just the final point is that Samson isn't fine-tuned for this relationship with God. He's just so selfishly focused on himself. Right? And it's only at the end of the chapter when he's exhausted from fighting that he cries out to God. Right? Because he suddenly has this great thirst. He never gives thanks for his strength. He never gives thanks for God's protection. He accuses God of forgetting him. Right? Despite all these victories that God has given Samson. God has been with him every step of the way, even in his missteps, but Samson only seems to care when Samson is suffering. Right? And so it's somewhat similar to a previous time when God brings water from a rock. So in Exodus 17, Moses is leading the Israelites out of the wilderness. And the Israelites, they're thirsty and they cry out to Moses, "Why did you bring us out of Egypt to kill us and our children and our livestock with thirst?" Right? They've completely forgotten the incredibly miraculous things God has done to free them out of slavery. Right? It's not like they were leaving this great place behind. They were enslaved and suffering in Egypt. But the Israelites, they can only see the present moment. They can't see what God has done. They can't see what God has ahead of them. They only see in their temporary suffering. They think God has abandoned them. And so God brings water from a rock to ease their suffering. For the Israelites, God brings water from a rock to ease Samson's suffering. Even in the midst of their complaining, God is still gracious to them. And so the question is, do we recognize the blessings God has given us? Or do we only go to God when we have a need, when we're suffering? Right? Do we cultivate grateful hearts? Do we look for the things that God has done? Do we look ahead to the things that God is doing? And keep the present in context with all of that? Do we remember that God has carried us every step of the way and will carry us every step of the way? And so even if we're suffering now, it doesn't mean that God has abandoned us. But God may be preparing us for something that is to come. So Judges 15, it's a reminder that we have a real enemy. Right? And God is actively fighting that real enemy on our behalf, using people like you and I to continue to build God's kingdom in the world. Let us remember that and be grateful. And recognize that God sustains us, even sending water from a rock, life out of something barren, life in the desert to give us hope until we reach the promised land.